Without further ado, let me introduce Danny Sheehan.
Hi. Well, good morning. Happy Saturday morning, everybody. You may note that I have a bit of a cold here, but I've got only a limited amount of time to do this morning, so I've brought a whole set of notes with me so that I can stay within the proper time. The bottom line is that there is, in fact, a great unrest abroad in the land right now. In the words of William Butler Yeats, that he penned 100 years ago at the end of World War I, he said, "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon can no longer hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosened, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." These are the words that Yeats used to describe the state of the world at the end of World War I, the Great War, the war that was fought to end all wars. Here today, we find ourselves at the end of the Cold War. The Cold War that lasted, in fact, for some 75 years. A lot of people try to pretend that the Cold War really began only after World War II. The Cold War actually began at the end of World War I with the violent overthrow of Tsar Alexander by the Bolshevik Revolution and the fielding of an international expeditionary force, a military force led by the United States that was fielded by the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, to attempt to kill in the cradle the socialist revolution that was inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution. That whole 75-year period that began at the end of World War I came to an end on December 31st of 1991, on that night when President Gorbachev signed the executive decree dissolving the Soviet Union, one of the two great superpowers that dominated affairs through the entire 20th century. And since that night, the very end of 1991, a dozen of the 100-year-old dictatorial regimes that were established at the end of World War I by the creation of certain arbitrary boundaries that were drawn by a commission that was chaired actually by Winston Churchill in 1922, made up of 20 Westerners that drew the boundaries of the states in a 32-nation area of the world, several 100,000 square miles. It's called the Eurasian Oblong, that runs from west to east, from the Adriatic Sea all the way eastward to the westernmost border of China in Saiking province, and from the north all the way from the southern border of Russia down through the Middle East to the Persian Gulf. That entails 32 different nations, and in that area, since the end of the Cold War, a dozen of those major arbitrary governments have now fallen. And the governments include Iran and Iraq and Egypt and the war in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Syria, and we're all familiar with the goings-on there. Indeed, the war is still raging as we gather here on Saturday morning, still in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, in Libya, and all along the westernmost frontier of Pakistan. There's 60 million human beings that are refugees right now that are pouring out of that area of the world into Europe, disregarding the borders of those nation states that were established as early as 1648 by the Treaty of Westphalia, that those boundaries are being disregarded, the cultures are being overwhelmed, the resources are being overwhelmed, and at the same time, terrorist bombs are killing the innocent in the streets and cafes of Paris. People are being gunned down on the streets of Southern California. And Southern California and all of our state is now suffering the worst drought in California in over 1,000 years. And a dozen of the candidates for the presidency of one of the two major political parties in the United States are just openly competing with each other to see who can propose the most brutal options to deal with the members of one of the great religions of our whole planet. You know, one of them is proposing actually carpet bombing entire cities of innocent Islamic people in the Middle East just to get at the terrorists who are hiding among them. Another is proposing torturing people that they capture just on the mere suspicion that they might be supporting the armed struggle against the troops that we have based in the Middle East now. And a third actually proposes that even if we torture someone and he turns out he doesn't know anything, he probably deserves it anyhow. In that same, in fact, the leading candidate of one of our two major political parties is actually advocating that we hunt down and murder the wives and children of those who have taken up arms against us, because he says even if these terrorists aren't deterred and aren't afraid of losing their own lives, maybe if they know that we're going to hunt down and kill their wives and children, that maybe that will deter them. And still a fourth of the candidates suggests that he wants to know whether we can make the sands glow by dropping an atomic bomb, actually in the middle of the Holy Lands. And at the same time, both of our polar ice caps are melting, that we know, at an ever-increasing rate. That we've got 2,000 of our planet's leading scientists telling us now that we're in the grips of a major global climate change process. And it's specifically, they talk about the fact that the proximate causation of this, not the sole and exclusive causation, but the proximate causation of this whole process is the production of fossil fuels, the petroleum and the coal and the natural gas that is being used by the major corporations to produce their products and to carry their products to market. And another set of the transnational corporations that are actually cutting down and burning 80,000 acres a day of the forests in the equatorial areas of our planet that constitute the lungs of our planet, that reprocess the carbon dioxide back into oxygen. And they're burning down and destroying these rainforests in order to have pasture land and grow soy beans to feed cattle, which they have 1.5 billion head of cattle now that are being produced so they can generate fast foods for us at Burger King and McDonald's and Wendy's and Carl Jr.'s. They slaughter 36 million head of cattle every year to feed these fast food stores. And the cattle, these 1.5 billion head of cattle, are actually excreting methane gas into the atmosphere. Catches 10 million tons of methane gas into the atmosphere from these cattle every single year. In another 100,000 billion tons of methane gas is trapped now beneath the permafrost areas along the Arctic and Antarctic circles at 70 degrees north and south latitude, which in fact is rapidly defrosting. And that this methane gas can be released, they think, within the next 30 to 40 years in an extinction event. Unless we can reduce, according to the scientists at the International Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations, unless we are able to reduce by 70% the annual global greenhouse gas emissions below the levels of 1999. And we have to do this by the year 2025. And yet the administration, even the United States, proposes reducing the global greenhouse gas emissions annually only by 33% by the year 2035. Half the amount of reduction necessary in twice the amount of time. Absolutely wedding us, basically, to a catastrophe. And the reality is the leaders of virtually every one of the spiritual communities on our planet, including most recently Pope Francis, has issued a major papal encyclical calling for the creation of a new, entirely new economic system that can develop and distribute the resources in a more equitable manner and not allow the major corporations to excrete these poisons into our atmosphere. And yet, all of the spiritual community is being openly defied by the people who hold the seats in the state legislatures and the nation-state legislatures around the world, who all insist that the 1% of the people who own the major 100 corporations have to be allowed to decide voluntarily whether or not they want to stop doing this or not, because those corporations, they say, are people. And they have the same fundamental human rights as any other person, which includes their inviolable property rights, and therefore we can't really regulate them. It turns out this is the exact same legal position that was taken by the American corporations between 1933 and 1936 during the height of the major depression, which required Franklin Roosevelt to threaten to pack the Supreme Court in order to stop them from making this argument. And here we are faced with this same argument again. And resultingly, the planet is witnessing the ever-increasing rise in the global mean temperature, which is generally pushing us now clearly toward the inevitable rise from a minimum of 1.5 to 3.5 feet in the global mean sea levels just during the age of our own children, and very likely during the age of our grandchildren to as much as 6 to 10 feet. And what this is threatening to do is to inundate the whole 20-mile area coastlines of the entire planet, below which 20% of all of the fresh water on our planet resides in the aquifers under the ground. And so it will contaminate 20%, 1/5 of all the existent potable water on our planet, which would be added to the 2/3 of all of our water, which is being drained away from the polar ice caps in the ice fields into the ocean. So we lose 2/3 of our potential drinking water and agricultural water from our polar ice caps, and we lose another 20% under the 20-mile stretch of the inundated shorelines around the country, around the world. And there are 403 private nuclear power plants within those 20-mile areas, just like Fukushima, that it would be put underwater, and they have no way of preparing for that at the present time. And so we need to understand that this process they're talking about happening within the lifetimes of our children and grandchildren, and that this is going to result in driving some 60+% of the people of our planet out of that 20-mile band of land around the planet, because by the year 2100, 63% of our entire human population will live within 20 miles of the seacoasts. So that we're looking at a potential massive human migration that is going to dwarf what we're looking at now in Europe, that is generating all of the huge catastrophe that we are looking at. And the fact is that if 2/3 of the fresh water of our planet from the ice fields and polar ice caps is drained into the oceans, it's going to change the salt level, the salinity of the oceans and the density of the oceans, and cause the thinning of the oceans so that the underwater sea currents will rise to the surface and dissipate. This is the Great Gulf Stream and the others that make the temperate zone of our planet possible, where 75% of all of the foodstuffs on the planet are grown. Now, it's difficult to overstate the clear kind of catastrophic dimensions of what is pending if, in fact, there is not some new paradigm designed. And ever since the end of the Cold War, on that night of December 31st of 1991, there's been this discussion going on about the need for a new paradigm. This began originally as the need to identify a new paradigm that would just be able to identify a set of commonly agreed upon principles pursuant to which the nation states of the East and the West could try to readjust their institutions, their commercial and economic and military institutions, to live more cooperatively and less competitively with each other. In fact, we were very much involved in this process. President Gorbachev, the former president of the Soviet Union, and Secretary James Baker, the former Republican Secretary of State of the United States, joined together and created the State of the World Forum. Many of you were there. One of the major strategic initiatives of that entire process from 1992 all the way through to 2001 was to attempt to identify the constituent elements of a new paradigm. That was the point. It was a fairly limited objective to identify a new paradigm that could just set forth some general principles that would enable the nation states of the East and the West to kind of readjust their economic and military and cultural institutions. There were, however, at that time, at the end of the Cold War, another large group of people who thought that there was an opportunity that was presented by the end of this then 75-year Cold War to actually identify a much more profound and deeper new paradigm. This was the new paradigm that had been postponed because of the Great Depression and World War II and that long-standing Cold War that had gone on. This was the new quantum worldview. This was the new worldview that many thought was sort of intellectually mandated by the extraordinary discoveries that were made between 1923 and 1926 by world-famous scientists such as Max Planck and Werner Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger, Wolfgang Pauli, and Louis de Broglie, and others that discovered the quantum realm, that began to discover that when we penetrated deeper and deeper into the subparticles of matter in the universe, that we began to discover an extraordinarily mysterious and wonderful world that actually put the lie to the then dominant scientific materialist worldview. Now, I would say that 98% of us that are in the room here today know about that and know about what the implications are, that the scientific, logical, positivist worldview that had come into being from the late 16th century to early 17th century with the scientific revolution, followed by the Enlightenment after that, had replaced the old, ancient, superstitious worldview that was dominated by elite royalist ecclesial authorities and the royalist families. And the new paradigm of scientific materialism descended upon the world. And that obtained for some 300 years, all the way up until these discoveries that were made between 1923 and 1926. But because of the intervention of the worldwide economic depression in 1929 and the chaos that followed in the World War and the Cold War, that there was a postponing of actually coming to grips with the full implications of this quantum worldview. So many thought that there at the end of the Cold War, that there was a great opportunity to go much deeper than simply the objectives of those of us that were involved in the State of the World Forum. Just across the bridge, just across the Golden Gate Bridge down here at the Presidio. And we gathered at the Fairfax Hotel, the same hotel where the United Nations was founded. We had these meetings over a series of years. Many of you know that one of my very best friends, Dr. Jim Garrison, who was my best friend at Harvard Divinity School, we did our graduate studies together there. And Sarah Nelson, my wife of 38 years, was the executive director of that State of the World Forum. Yet, for reasons that I'll discuss in our workshop tomorrow, we were unable to successfully get to a point where there was common agreement on many of those principles prior to the events of 9/11. Many of you were there. I was there doing a speech during the events of 9/11, and we all addressed the sort of catastrophe that represented with regard to this effort to try to bring the world to a new place of coming to a higher worldview. But the bottom line is we were unable at that time to succeed. So many of us believed that the quantum worldview was likely to be the primary candidate to become the new worldview at that time. But as it turns out, that following the events of 9/11, there became a whole series of other contenders for the title of this new post-Cold War worldview. The very first of these that came upon us was the New American Century. What happened is instantaneously after the December 31st, 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union, the very following Monday, a group of people within the administration of George H.W. Bush, we need to remember now, January 1992, George H.W. Bush is now the president. He was elected in 1988 after serving the 2 terms as the vice president of Reagan between 1980 and 1988. And he's the president of the United States. Within his administration, in the Defense Department, remember, the Secretary of Defense for George H.W. Bush was Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney and his assistant, Paul Wolfowitz, and his staff, David Addington and Scooter Libby and others, they all gathered in the West Wing of the White House, and they said, oh, look, that now that the Soviet Union has dissolved, we have an opportunity to take advantage of this unique moment in history, pursuant to which what we can do is we can establish full spectrum dominance over the entire planet. Rather than reducing our military budget, why don't we increase our military budget and we can become unchallenged throughout the entire 21st century anywhere on the planet. And they actually proposed a massive buildup of the United States military to establish an authoritarian dominance all over the entire planet. Many people aren't aware of that had happened. But they actually put it forth in the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document. And they actually began to circulate that on the morning of April 18th to certain select members of the cabinet of George H.W. Bush and a certain select number of people at the United States Pentagon. Fortunately, the Washington Post got a hold of a copy of it, read it, and they wrote this aggressive editorial against it, saying that, look, this was outrageous. This was a completely authoritarian worldview. It was a return to the same worldview that had dominated Western civilization prior to World War I. That entire era of the robber barons in the Manifest Destiny, in the white man's burden, where they actually thought that they had the authority to go in and seize and take the resources of other people of the world, characterized by diplomacy. And both the Washington Post and the New York Times wrote aggressive editorials against it, so they withdrew that authoritarian worldview proposal. And George H.W. Bush, along with his director of covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency, Theodore Shackley, drafted an alternative, a second iteration of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, replacing the authoritarian worldview, that unilateral authoritarian militaristic worldview, with a reactionary worldview. What they proposed in this, following the recommendations of Professor Samuel P. Huntington, who was the president of the American Political Science Association, and also the editor-in-chief of the Council on Foreign Relations, famous Foreign Policy magazine, as well as the Olin Professor of International Law at Harvard University. He wrote a book, or a major essay, he made a major presentation called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. And in that, he proposed that we establish a reactionary worldview that, in fact, would replace the Soviet Union with China, and that we had to prepare in the West to confront China in the rising Asian empire. And he recommended that we begin to gird our loins collectively and organize everything in our culture and to confront the rising threat of China in the new Asian empire. And he set this forth in a major essay in the Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Policy magazine. And George H.W. Bush followed that recommendation and set forth a second draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, recommending the adoption of this new reactionary worldview. as an alternative to the authoritarian worldview. And in it, he proposed that the United States go forward and establish what he called a new Northern Industrial Alliance to substitute for the United Nations. Under the leadership of the United States, NATO would then gather together a group of people, and the nation states that would be involved in this would be the United States, Canada, Mexico, pointing out not to have Mexico led by the indigenous people of Mexico, but by the PRI, which is made up of the Caucasian Castilian Spanish in Mexico, and the United Kingdom, and France, and Italy, and Spain, and the new reunified Germany, they pointed out. And, remarkably enough, also Russia, now that it had spun off all of its ethnic provinces, which began to chill anyone who began to hear about that, because this was the grand alliance of all of the Caucasian nations of the world to join in unison, to be able to work together, not unilaterally on the part of the United States, but in fact all of the Caucasian nations of the world to be able to organize against China. And Samuel Huntington even pointed out in his major essay that he was sure that this would inevitably lead to a nuclear confrontation between the West and China. So this was the second candidate that was being set forth as the new paradigm, which, upon any kind of analysis, you can clearly see is the old paradigm, just substituting for Russia, substituting China. But now it's got this dangerous kind of racialist overtone to it. So that was the second major contender for the title of the new paradigm, was the reactionary worldview. And followed up right away on that was the conservative worldview that was advocated. And this, strangely enough, was being advocated now by the new Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party saw that the leadership of the Republican Party was advocating an authoritarian worldview. Dick Cheney and Wolfowitz and all of those authoritarians called the Vulcans inside that Republican administration, or the reactionary worldview that was being proposed by H.W. Bush and Huntington and the Council on Foreign Relations and others. So the Democrats are saying, well, look, there's only two political parties. Why should we take any more radical a position than is absolutely necessary? Why don't we just take up the position in the conservative position? And so they designed an entire new, more conservative Democratic Party led by Richard Gebhardt, the Democratic Leadership Conference, and they set forth an entire new panoply of proposals that are much more conservative, backing away specifically from the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal democratic policies of more egalitarian sharing of resources and income, the increasing of regulations on corporate capitalism, et cetera. They wanted to do away with all of those and take up a more conservative position. And that was what was really proposed by Bill Clinton. And it turns out Hillary Clinton was the actual chairperson of the policy committee of the new Democratic Leadership Conference. So that it wasn't surprising that Obama and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and the others are taking very conservative positions, and that they're backing away from a lot of those major policies that are set forth by the Roosevelt Democratic Party, that kind of liberal to progressive ethos of the Democratic Party. So those contenders immediately presented themselves at the end of the Cold War. And then there was another major contender that I want to get up in front of us here, and that was this new postmodern worldview. And this was a comparatively new worldview that basically asserted, quite appealingly on the face of it, that look, they were saying, the more we find out about quantum physics and investigate the subcomponent elements of reality, and we do a deeper investigation, we can tell that every single one of these major worldviews, the traditional major human worldviews that we'll get to in a moment here, that every one of these is predicated upon a certain set of factual assumptions that cannot really be ultimately proven. And it turns out that every one of these major worldviews, from the authoritarian worldview to the reactionary worldview to the conservative worldview to the moderate worldview to the liberal worldview to the progressive worldview to the utopian worldview that we'll discuss in a moment, the proponents of these worldviews are almost all powerful, white, male capitalists. And that they're designing these worldviews to basically coax you into believing them so that you can follow a worldview that authorizes them to run everything. All right? Whether it's through representative democracy, where you have almost nothing to say about what your representative does, where political parties choose them and you don't even know what's going on, all the way to authoritarian worldview people. These are all the same people. And so there was this kind of semi-liberal kind of ethos afield in the postmodern worldview saying, look when you analyze each one of these worldviews deeply enough, it falls apart. And it is nothing more than a transparent hoax that is being foisted upon you to justify the power in the elite of these people who repress women, repress blacks, repress poor people, repress other ethnic groups, repress foreigners, And so therefore what you should do is you should eschew all of these worldviews. Anybody who comes to you and proposes a thoroughgoing, systematic worldview, you always watch out for what they're up to. Because what they're really up to is trying to justify getting everybody to do what they want them to do. And usually that ends up being to the benefit of the people proposing it. That, in short, with apologies to the Academy for the simplistic analysis of the postmodern worldview, sets forth the contenders that really presented themselves there at the end of the Cold War, except, of course, for those same proponents of all the same traditional worldviews. That there's a whole spectrum, an octave of basic worldviews that our human family has settled upon. And, of course, the adherents to those traditional worldviews all believed that there was no need to really have a new worldview. All we had to do is have everybody join them in theirs. And that if you just understood my worldview a little better, and its kind of subtleties and paradoxes, and you really understood it in great enough depth, you would agree with me that our worldview is best and all those others are wrong. And that's the major challenge that we're confronted by, is that people who do adhere to a particular systematic worldview do so as a kind of faith. And they do so in a way that makes it very difficult to get them to move. And so I have two tasks that have been I've been privileged to get to address here this weekend with us. One of them is to point out to you what the academic architecture is of a thoroughgoing, systematic human worldview. Because you hear an awful lot of talk about, this person is a liberal, or that person is a reactionary, or that person's a fascist, or that person is a closet socialist. You hear all of these terms tossed around by everybody, but you can't really tell what they're talking about. Half of the time they're inaccurate, and even when they are accurate, they don't explain what that means. And so that what I want to be able to do here today, one of the things I want to be able to do, the two things, is to show you what the architecture of a genuine, thoroughgoing, and systematic worldview looks like, so that we know what the structure of an architecture looks like. If we're going to be having a new paradigm worldview, we need to know what the particular requirements are of a truly systematic worldview, if we're going to be able to discern one. The second thing, the task that I have, is to elucidate the specifics of a genuinely new paradigm, so that we're careful not to simply just reiterate one of the classic worldviews, because otherwise we're just falling prey to, pumping up one worldview and saying all the rest are wrong. So let me briefly, in the time that I have left, because we're going to go into great depth about this in the workshop tomorrow, which I believe is at 1 o'clock or so after lunch tomorrow. And I will give you the full details of this. But let me point out quickly what this amounts to. That I came upon this. I'd already graduated from Harvard College and studied under Henry Kissinger and Schlesinger and Reisman and all these other people, and gone on to Harvard Law School and been out practicing law and had been in front of the Supreme Court and represented the New York Times in the Pentagon Papers case and a bunch of other stuff that I had done. I was at F. Lee Bailey's office. We were doing the Watergate burglary case. We were representing James McCord, the CIA wiretapping specialist that we got to blow the whistle on Richard Nixon and in the plumbers unit. And it turns out that Bailey and I kept having these confrontations about, what the office was doing and what the ultimate objective of our office was, et cetera. And I was invited out to represent the American Civil Liberties Union at the Wounded Knee occupations back in 1973. And I came back from the occupations, and Bailey confronted me and said to me, "Which side were you on out there?" And I tried to explain to him that I was working with the FBI to try to negotiate getting food and medical supplies into the people that were in the compound. And he said, "What the hell good did that do us?" He said, if you've been working for the Justice Department, we could have gotten some goodwill, and, I could have sent you in to help negotiate a better sentence, perhaps, for like one of the Angiulo brothers. So I was just kind of flabbergasted. I mean, it was like ships literally passing in the night. That it was clear I was incapable of communicating to him why I thought that the practice of the law involved a higher calling than this. And so, long story, but the bottom line is I ended up going over to see Professor Rawls, who was over at Harvard, and he invited me to come back to do my master's and PhD work in comparative social ethics. It was there that I discovered, back at Harvard University, that it turns out that Dr. Talcott Parsons, who was the head of the Department of Sociology at Harvard University for like 33 years, he and his students, and his master's degree and PhD degree students over the years, undertook a series of thousands and thousands of interviews. And Talcott Parsons determined that when our human family is confronted by a particular public policy problem, whether it's whether to use nuclear weapons against a particular country, whether it's to authorize torture or not, whether it's to authorize abortion, whether or not it's to sign the Equal Rights Amendment, any particular public policy problem that an individual human community is confronted by, Talcott Parsons determined that our human family will, in fact, divide ourselves into, he thought, basically 5 basic different factions, which he called simply right systematists, left systematists. I know it, you can't, this happens to me a lot. Okay, here we are. This looks like a big fat guy. There we go. Okay, right systematists and left systematists, right? And then just inside the right systematists, he called what he called right marginalists. And then on the left, big surprise, left marginalists. And then a group that he called middle marginalists. Okay? And he said that this happens all the time, that you will find that with adequate discussion and analysis and debate, almost any adequately sized community will divide itself into these factions over almost any issue. I happen to have done my master's thesis by pointing out that I thought that there were in fact 7 of these instead of 5, so that there was a right middle marginalist and a left middle marginalist, which were in fact the classic conservatives and liberals. And that's what I was writing my master's thesis at there when I ended up getting recruited to become the chief counsel for the United States Jesuit headquarters in Washington, D.C., and helped run their social ministry office for 10 years in Washington. And what we discovered is I kept asking myself, what is it that causes people? The obvious question. What is it that causes a person to gravitate toward one or another of these particular 7 worldviews? And it turns out that you can cut into these worldviews any number of places, but the one that people are most familiar with is the political philosophy of the adherents to these worldviews. And this is where you get the authoritarians. Okay, you get that's actually the. I can't see what the colors are. Anyway, you get authoritarians, you get reactionaries. Remember the ones that we talk about. Here is Dick Cheney, in Scooter Libby and Wolfowitz, and those guys that wanted to have full spectrum dominance, unilateral military dominion around the whole world. Here is the reactionaries, the George H.W. Bush and Shackley and the others. They wanted to, and Samuel Huntington, that wanted to set up this intense dialectic between the Western powers in China. And then you have your conservatives, which is now the Democratic Party here, and then you have your moderates. Okay. This is what Bill Clinton and Gore and the others were advertising themselves as, but you kept seeing that they kept on advocating very, very conservative policies. And then you have over here the liberals, okay, and then you have your progressives, okay, and then you have what they call utopians over here, okay? And so what you have is you have seven different worldviews. They're systematic worldviews. And so the fundamental question that presents itself to us, and here where it starts to get really interesting, this is helpful to be able to particularize what it is that we're talking about here. But the most important thing, oops, I lost my little thing. I stuck it way over here. Thank you. Okay, that the important question that arises, of course, is what in the world causes a person to adhere to an authoritarian worldview as distinct from a reactionary worldview or a conservative worldview, et cetera. And one of the major proteges of Talcott Parsons, Dr. Ralph Potter, who was the head of the Department of Comparative Social Ethics at Harvard University, is still there, actually. What he determined is that there are 4 ultimate questions of fact about ultimate reality that virtually every person has to answer for herself or himself. And that depending on how you answer those 4, what he calls pillar questions, it'll determine all the rest of the beliefs that you have, that they all flow from that. And he said that there are 4 questions, okay? The first question is the cosmological question. The cosmological question is that ultimate question is, where did the cosmos come from? How did the cosmos come into being? That old philosophical question is, why is there this something rather than nothing? And that ultimate cosmological question has to get answered because it is such a profound and fundamental question. Even if you don't think about it consciously and discuss it over the dinner table, the fact of the matter is every individual sentient consciousness has to kind of come to some kind of instinctive belief or understanding about that, at least unconsciously, in order to get oriented and have a predicate for the rest of their beliefs. The second fundamental question is what they refer to as teleology, or the teleological question. And that is, once the universe gets into existence, how is it unfolding? Is the universe unfolding in some systematic, comprehensible way, moving from alpha to omega? Is there some pattern that can be discerned in the unfolding of the universe that implies some kind of meaning, some kind of pattern that you can comport your conduct with in some way that enables you to predict what's getting ready to happen, so you can plan to comport your conduct in something that will result in successful outcomes, etc. This is the teleological question. And the third fundamental question is, what the big one is, they call the ontological question. The ontological question, these are all just big words for what it is that we're explaining. The ontological question has to do with consciousness. How did consciousness come into existence? Assuming that there's a universe made up of rocks and water and all these kind of things, how in the world did consciousness actually come into existence? How did a certain confluence of mass and energy all of a sudden become sentient, that had some kind of a capacity to discern itself as separate and apart from the rest of the entities and actually motivate itself to move as an entity, to survive or to multiply or to engage in various kinds of activities? Ontologically, how do individual collectives of mass and energy come to discern themselves as sentient and conscious? Now, this is a fundamental question. This is the big question about, here you find yourself riding around up behind your eyeballs, kind of looking out around to the rest of the world and reflecting upon the relationship between yourself and the rest of reality. And almost all of the fundamental questions of ethics are derived from that experience. But this is the big ontological question. And the fourth and final of the pillar questions is what they refer to as the epistemological question. And that is simply put, that what are the means that we as human beings, Homo sapiens, what are the means that we have at our disposal by means of which we can possibly answer cosmic questions like this? Are we dependent upon our 5 scientifically acknowledged senses of hearing and seeing and touching and tasting and smelling, multiplied by our technology, and that we can then gather the data from those 5 senses and then process it through our intellect and kind of come to some sort of logical, intellectual answer to these questions? Are we confined to that particular process by means of which to come to answers to these huge cosmic questions? Or is it possible that there are other faculties that we have? This major discussion about the existence of a 6th sense, this extrasensory perception, this faculty by means of which we might be able to discern data at a distance, be able to engage in precognition, to be able to discern events that have not taken place yet, be able to discern events that are taking place at distant places in the world that we have no direct immediate access to, yet we know what's there. That this whole question of the epistemological question of how we gather data and come to know about facts to be able to answer these questions. These are the 4. And they refer to these 4 major questions as Potter's box. This is the famous Potter's box that they refer to. And what they've discovered is that if in fact a person answers these 4 cosmic questions in a way that is mutually consistent with each of the other 3, so that your answers are self-referentially and internally consistent with each other, it will in fact generate a consistent mode of ethical reasoning. Because your ethical reasoning is predicated upon what you ultimately believe to be true. And it's so long as you make your decisions predicated upon what you believe to be factually true, then your decisions have integrity. And then they're ethical. and you can elucidate and articulate the principle that undergirds the answers to all of these questions. And it generates a particular, as I said, mode of ethical reasoning. Okay? Now, when you apply that particular mode of ethical reasoning to all of the normal work-a-day problems and challenges that any man or woman has during the course of their life, what you do is you end up generating a philosophy. Philosophy flows from the composite answers that you provide to each of those particular types of challenges in a human life. And it generates an entire consistent philosophy. And then, derivative of that philosophy is one's political philosophy. The political philosophy, the decision that you make as to how a community ought to go about making our collective decisions. The public policy questions. The political worldview that you develop is directly derivative of your philosophy. And so you have the authoritarian, the reactionary, the conservative, the moderate, the liberal, the progressive, and the utopian. Now, these are the classic set of 7 major worldviews that are presently operative in the world today. And so you sort of pose the question that was put by I think his name Tyler Durden or something, the character that Brad Pitt played in Fight Game. Remember when he put the question to Edward Norton, and Edward Norton explained how he was living his life and he was being kind of charming and stuff. And Durden said to him, "How's that working for you?" Okay, so you ask yourself, how are these worldviews working for us? Might we just retreat into adhering to one or another of these traditional worldviews and just getting to understand them more thoroughly and being more effective in persuading others to come to join us in this? Or do we need to have some radically new alternative worldview? What I'm going to be proposing here today, and we'll discuss in our workshop tomorrow at 1 o'clock, is that there is, in fact, a radically new worldview that needs to be considered. While we go about inductively working on the quantum worldview, step by step learning one more mystery after another of the quantum physics and trying to understand what the implications of this is and how it relates to mysticism and how it relates to Hinduism, and reading all the books that we can from the crack in the cosmic egg to the Tao of physics and all the things that we're doing. That inductive process by means of which we're working toward pointing toward the individuated characteristics of a new worldview, I'm going to be proposing that we at the same time have a partner deductive worldview. A brief moment. Inductive process is by means of which you just gather more and more and more and more and more and more data, and you keep trying to discern whether there's some sort of pattern that is sort of induced by the evidence. A deductive method of analysis is you come to some sort of flash of insight, and then what you do is you set forth a hypothesis and you begin to search through existent data to find what confirms it. And then you look into areas where data has to exist if you're correct, and you can discover it existing in there rather than spending all the time of searching through all the other alternatives. I'm proposing that we partner up, that we pursue the inductive process of the quantum worldview here at the end of the Cold War, but that we have a deductive a set of principles to work by. And what I'm going to be suggesting is that it's extremely important that we realize that right at the same time that the end of the Cold War came about, our human family launched the Hubble Space Telescope. And soon thereafter, the Kepler Planet Hunter, and then the Planck telescope. We have 3 major telescopes that are now in space orbiting. What we've discovered is that, lo and behold, it turns out that there are 4 times the number of stars in our Milky Way galaxy than our human family believed, all during the 20th century. And that they believed there were 100 billion stars. Turns out they've discovered through the three telescopes that there's 400 billion stars. Secondly, they discovered that of these 400 billion stars, that 20% of these stars actually have planets around them. Now, shockingly enough, it was only the last 10 years that our scientific community has acknowledged that there were any planets anywhere in the entire universe other than in our solar system. Now, this is one of the peculiar subfunctions of our scientific, logical, positivist worldview, is that not only do we not know that certain things exist that we haven't smelled, touched, tasted, or felt, but in fact we take the position that they don't exist until such time as we can feel them or see them. And then all of a sudden they sort of pop into existence. And so what's happened is we've got all these planets that have popped into existence now. And it turns out that 25% of these planets exist in what they call the Goldilocks zone, which is not too far from their sun and not too close to their sun. So it's not too hot, not too cold. It can actually produce potential life. And that they realize now that there's a higher and higher probability of life being discovered. You've all heard about that process. What you haven't heard about, many of you, is that in November of 2009, the Vatican convened an entire gathering of 50 world scientists. And the world scientists all met with the heads of the Vatican, and the Vatican issued a public statement. It was issued by Father Jose Gabriel Funes, the head of the Pontifical Observatory. And he said, in light of the discovery of an ever-increasing number of planets that appear to be capable of sustaining life, it is more and more probable that we are going to be discovering life elsewhere in the universe much, much sooner than anyone expects. And therefore, the time has begun to initiate a very serious conversation about the profound philosophical and theological questions that are going to be posed to our human family when we encounter life elsewhere in the universe. And he has now been assigned to the Jesuit University in Argentina and is teaching the very first college-level course on the philosophical and theological implications of contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence, not just microbiotic life, but an extraterrestrial intelligence, highly intelligent, highly technologically developed. And it turns out that there's every probability that there is life, technical life, and intelligent life on some 50 billion planets in our universe, many tens of thousands of which exist right in our own Milky Way galaxy. And that many of these could be tens of thousands, millions of years in advance of our human civilization. And so that I suggest that it is more than practical and intelligent for us to begin this discussion of what it is that we truly believe about ourselves as a human family, so that when we sit across the table from the people to explain to them what we think and what we believe, that we have a human worldview that is not subject to ridicule because it's so foolish. And so this is a deductive worldview that we have to develop. And so what I'm going to be doing is in the workshop, I'm going to be setting forth what I believe the answers are, the cosmological, teleological, ontological, and epistemological answers are to the profound philosophical and theological questions that are posed, so that we can avoid the experience that has been encountered by every more primitive culture on our planet, when it is encountered by a more highly technologically developed civilization. Every single instance in which that has happened, the more primitive civilization has disappeared, and their entire race has been assimilated by the more technical civilization. I do not want that to happen to our human family. I think our human family is entitled to a place at the table in the galactic community, but we have to earn it. We can't just sit around waiting for someone else to come and intervene and tell us the answers to these questions. These are the questions we have to ask. This is what we're going to be doing in the workshop tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And I thank you for the hour in 3 minutes.